The popular image of nuclear war is a strategic deception. You have been conditioned to watch the sky, to calculate the kinetic cost of a launch-on warning protocol. This is a deliberate misdirection. The primary vector for escalation is not a missile, it is silence. The real first strike is not kinetic. It is a systemic decapitation of the West's digital nervous system. Authoritative analysis from CSIS highlights the primary targets: the 1.4 million kilometers of undersea fiber optic cables that carry 99% of all intercontinental data traffic, including trillions in daily financial transactions. Simultaneously, the attack vector targets low Earth orbit. Not with missiles, but with non-attributable methods: dazzling lasers, high-powered microwave bursts, GPS spoofing. The objective is not destruction, but temporary systemic blindness. The cost is negligible. The impact is absolute. This protocol creates the blind Leviathan, a military and economic superpower suddenly stripped of its sight and hearing. Its markets are frozen. Its fleets are deaf. It cannot verify threats or coordinate a conventional response. A state facing a solvency crisis, evidenced by Germany's record 17,604 bankruptcies in 2025, cannot absorb this shock. A blinded, cornered power, unable to trust its own data and facing economic collapse, is forced to operate on its most extreme protocols. The silence is the trigger. It makes the unthinkable a mathematical certainty. The prevailing analysis of the Ukraine conflict is a strategic misdirection. This is not a war of choice. It is a solvency crisis. CSS analysis confirms the kinetic campaign has become a significant domestic liability for the Kremlin. The operational tempo, sustained material losses, and economic isolation create a burn rate that is mathematically unsustainable against a fully mobilized Western industrial base. Protracted conventional warfare is a zero-sum game. Russia cannot win on paper. The kinetic cost of attritional conflict, every tank, every artillery shell, every trained soldier, is an entry on a balance sheet rapidly approaching insolvency. When a state actor's primary liabilities threaten to trigger systemic collapse, the strategic playbook is discarded. This is the pivot point. Financial weakness forces a strategic pivot to asymmetry. Russia's nuclear arsenal ceases to be a deterrent of last resort and becomes its most viable financial instrument. It is the only asset capable of forcing a termination of hostilities on terms that do not result in the liquidation of the Russian state itself. The Kremlin's calculus is validated not by events on the Russian front, but by the systemic decay of its primary adversary's industrial core, Germany. The 20-year high in bankruptcies in 2025, with 17,604 corporate insolvencies as documented by the Leibniz Institute, is not a separate crisis. It is the signal that the West lacks the economic stamina for a protracted conflict. This perception of Western industrial fragility eliminates the viability of a conventional war of attrition. It makes escalation the only logical path. A limited, tactical nuclear demonstration becomes a cheaper, faster mechanism to force a settlement than a decade of unwinnable kinetic grinding. This is not a strategy of conquest. It is a solvency protocol. The central calculation of modern conflict is no longer troop numbers, but the kinetic cost-exchange ratio. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, or ROSI, codify the core problem. A $5 million main battle tank is now being systematically hunted and destroyed by a $500 FPV drone. This is not a tactical imbalance. It is a systemic economic failure. The cost to destroy is 10,000 times less than the cost to build. This phenomenon is clinically referred to as the democratization of violence, the erosion of the state's monopoly on high lethality force through low-cost, commercially available technology. When a nation's industrial base is hollowed out, Evidenced by Germany's record 17,604 corporate bankruptcies in 2025, it cannot sustain a war of attrition against an adversary leveraging this extreme asymmetric cost advantage. The economic model for protracted conventional warfare is mathematically broken. This forces a strategic pivot away from attrition and towards escalation, as the only remaining lever for a cornered power is the one that bypasses the ruinous economics of the conventional battlefield, the nuclear launch protocol. The conflicts broadcast on your screen are not the real war. They are proxy laboratories. CSIS reports identify these emergent gray zones, from resource-rich sectors in South Africa to strategic northern territories in Canada, not as the cause of global instability, but as sterile staging grounds. They are designed to test the West's breaking points at a low kinetic cost, measuring response times, supply chain fragility, and political will. The true battlefield is economic solvency. While legacy media fixates on tactical movements detailed in the Institute for the Study of War Assessments, the core liability is ignored. According to the Leibniz Institute, Germany registered a historic 17,604 corporate bankruptcies in 2025, a 20-year high. This is not a recession. It is a systemic deindustrialization. An industrial power that cannot produce cannot wage a protracted conventional war. It becomes a liability. This solvency crisis creates the strategic vacuum that these gray zones fill. Adversaries observe this decay as a mathematical variable. They read the same data from sources like Remix News. While the EU flounders, China automates. This isn't about ideology, it's about logistical capacity. One system builds a robust, insulated production base. The other accelerates its own economic fragility. Every bullet, every logistical flight, every deployment has a price tag that debits from a failing economic system. Protracted conventional warfare requires a solvent industrial base. The German collapse removes that variable from the NATO equation. The gray zones, therefore, become the primary vector for conflict, arenas where the West's financial weakness can be leveraged without triggering a full-scale kinetic response it can no longer afford. The math is irrefutable. As the West's economic viability decays, its strategic playbook shrinks. It loses the option of conventional endurance. RUSI analysts confirm this forces a dangerous strategic recalculation across the board. The gray zones are the symptom, but the systemic industrial collapse is the precondition. This is the mechanism that lowers the threshold for escalation, forcing cornered adversaries toward the only asymmetric leverage they have left. The final decision for global thermonuclear war will not be made by a rational actor. It will be made by a terrified commander following a pre-written protocol with a 15-minute deadline. This protocol is known as launch on warning. It exists to ensure a state can retaliate before its own command structure is decapitated by a first strike. According to strategic analysis from RUSI, the doctrine is a brutal calculation. If early warning satellites and ground-based radar detect incoming enemy missiles, the leadership has only the flight time of those missiles, minutes, to verify the threat and authorize a counter-launch. Waiting for impact confirmation is not an option. Waiting means losing the ability to fire back. The system is engineered for speed, not certainty. This is where the fog of digital war becomes the primary accelerant. An adversary does not need to fire a single kinetic weapon. A sophisticated cyber attack can blind the early warning network. It can spoof the radar, creating fleets of phantom missiles. For the commander in the bunker, the screens go black, or worse, they fill with terrifying, unverifiable data. The protocol is absolute. In the face of sensory deprivation, the doctrine forces a binary choice. Launch based on terrifyingly incomplete data, or bet the nation's existence that it is a bluff. When a state's conventional military and industrial base is in a state of systemic decay, as evidenced by the German industrial collapse where bankruptcies hit a 20-year high. It cannot afford a protracted conflict. It has zero capacity to absorb a first strike. The economic solvency crisis removes any ambiguity from the decision. A cornered adversary, watching its industrial heartland flatline and facing pressure on its frontiers, as documented in the Institute for the Study of War Assessments, sees only one path to survival. The cyber attack is merely the trigger. The commander is not making a choice. They are the final gear in a machine designed to activate under precisely these conditions. It becomes a mathematical certainty. The West's capacity for protracted kinetic engagement is a function of its industrial solvency. That solvency no longer exists. The German deindustrialization, which saw a 20-year high in bankruptcies in 2025, is not a recession. It is a strategic liability. An industrial base that cannot produce cannot sustain a war of attrition. The math does not lie. This economic decay eliminates the viability of conventional conflict, forcing a recalculation for opposing forces. According to CSIS analysis, a state with depleted conventional capacity facing an economically weakened but numerically superior bloc does not surrender. It leverages its final asymmetric advantage to alter the strategic calculus. The logical precursor to a launch-on-warning posture is not rhetoric. It is a non-kinetic calibration shot, a deniable event designed to test response protocols and demonstrate reach without triggering a mandatory kinetic response. Its purpose is to signal that the core systems which enable Western economic life are vulnerable. The calibration forecast. Within the next 12 months, expect a full-day logistics paralysis at a major North Sea port, likely Hamburg or Rotterdam. The vector will be an attribution-impossible cascading failure in the terminal operating system. Publicly, it will be attributed to a software glitch or a zero-day exploit from a non-state actor. RUSI analysts will note the event's timing and sophistication are inconsistent with criminal syndicates. The economic damage will register in the low billions. There will be no formal attribution. This is not a hack. It is the final warning before the cost of conflict becomes infinite.